Welcome to Floating Questions, the podcast where curiosity leads, we follow, and stories unfold. My name's Ray, simply asking questions. Shall we begin? Welcome to the podcast, Shane. Would you like to give us a little bit of self-intro?
I would love to. My name is Shane Weisberg, and I'm super happy to have been invited to be on this podcast. Sounds like a really cool project that you've embarked on. I'm glad to be a part of it. Ray and I were classmates for a year at MIT doing our business analytics master's program, where we learned all sorts of fun stuff about optimization and data science and interpretability, all of which I've been promised will not be on the test today. Let's hope that was truthful. Besides that, I'm happy to talk about all sorts of stuff, including being outside and sports, and I'm excited to see what questions you come up for on those for other topics.
Let's just start with the things outside work, because I know you're into hiking. Why are you into hiking?
Because it's a key to getting to places that other people do not go, that other people do not want to go, where you can get alone for a little while and be out in nature. Just being out in nature, not necessarily a spiritual experience for me, but it's a very personal, important part of existing. I love getting out there. I love climbing to the top of big things. And yeah, it's definitely just when I'm at my happiest is being outside and on trail somewhere.
While you're hiking, do you have a lot of thoughts?
It definitely depends. I definitely love hiking alone. I do that. And that's when my thoughts are at the most active. But it's also great to be part of a group and just chatting about nothing, or even walking silently in a group. There's a lot of different ways to do it. I went on a long hike with two couples. I was the fifth wheel, and they spent most of the way down talking about wedding rings. And I was very happy to just not be part of that conversation and let my mind wander. But I learned a lot about wedding ring shopping and managed to avoid making a one ring to rule them all joke to my Lord of the Rings friend. So when I'm alone, I definitely let my thoughts swirl. It's when I do some of my best thinking. I don't meditate or anything like that, but I would say that's the closest I get to being in a meditative state where I can just zone out for a while. I also, in my spare time recently, have been pushing myself to do more creative stuff, and for the most part, that's been writing. And when I get stumped and I need to figure out how to connect the dots in a story, or just finish something or solve some sort of problem, I'll go. It doesn't even have to be a hike, but I'll go walking, and that's usually the place where I end up solving most of my problems.
Okay, wait a minute. Creative writing. Are you writing a fiction?
I write sci-fi or fantasy or somewhere in that realm.
Do you do it right now for just your own, pleasure, or are you going to have a go of publishing something?
I do it for myself for the most part. I read a lot. I've always read a lot. My family, both my parents work in publishing, and so reading has always been a big part of just life. And so at some point, I think everyone who reads arrives at the same question: is, wait, could I do this? And for a while, the answer was no. But the nice thing about writing is you can just keep putting words down on the page until you stop, and eventually you have something, and it's usually a disaster. And it definitely was for me as well. But then I went back to that disaster 2 years later, and I was like, this is kind of cool. And it was nice to have it. And to be like, I made this, and it's a lot of words, and it doesn't make a lot of sense. But every once in a while, there would be a sentence or two, and I was like, I really like that. And so I scrapped it completely, started over, and it's a skill, so you get better at it. And I've had more fun as I've gotten better at it. And so I have a lot of stuff that I occasionally will go back and read, and it's really fun. But I've never really felt like the need to go out and publish it. I think it's cool to have a thing that you did. Part of it is also definitely just a fear component. It's very personal, right? You put a lot of your thoughts and feelings into something, and suddenly you're like, wait, other people are going to be able to see this? Absolutely not. But I made a huge step recently by letting my good friend Mark, who is one of my creative partners, for the first time ever, read something that I wrote in exchange for me reading something of his. And it was nice, and it was less difficult to let myself be exposed like that than I expected. So I wouldn't rule it out, but publication was never the goal. It was just more of a fun thing to have.
Love this bit. What made you decide to shift your perspective from, wait a minute, I can't do this, to maybe I would just start trying?
I think in some ways, let's link everything together. It's a lot like hiking. There's really nothing to hiking. You just have to walk until you turn around and then walk back where you came from, or sometimes it's even a loop. But at some point, it just comes down to taking the next step. And you can just each time go and take the next step. And that's why when people are like, oh, it's too long or it's too hard, I just tend not to really buy that. And there's definitely reasons to stop, right? Maybe you break your ankle, or maybe it's raining and you're going to get hypothermia. But at a certain point, you can just keep going. And I think writing is a lot like that, right? You can always just keep putting words down on the page. They don't have to make sense. They don't have to be complete sentences. But at some point, if you put enough words down, then you have something. And then you can go back and revise them, or you can not. There's nothing stopping me from putting as many words as I want down on this piece of paper.
100%. My next question is, writing in a business context, I realized the process that I reason through something is completely different from how I should present it to other people, because the way that I see it usually isn't so intuitive for other people to see. So I have to rearrange information in such a way that is a lot more potentially intuitive for other people. And that process is extremely painful, because not only you have to reason through everything to the bottom, but also you need to break down your reasoning structure so that it becomes a story for other people. I wonder, in creative writing, whether this is similar, or actually you encounter some completely different types of problems that is just in general really difficult to tackle.
I would say it's very, very applicable. As long as I've been writing, in like you, mostly in a school context or a technical context or a business context, that has been one of the foremost problems that I've had to work with, because everyone's mind works differently to start with. And then when you take stuff from your mind and putting it down on paper, you're obviously simplifying dramatically. And so my mom, who is an editor professionally, would always edit my school essays and be like, this part right here doesn't make any sense. You're not saying what you think you're saying. And I'd be like, obviously I'm saying exactly what I think I'm saying. How could you not see that? And so we go back and forth until the words on the page actually matched up much better with the things in my head. But that has always been an issue, because, that simplification process, that projection process is imprecise, and is for sure a problem in writing fiction, because if you're telling a story that's in your head, you, in theory, know the beginning and the ending and all the important parts in between. That's not very true, but in theory. But if you don't put those things down on paper, then the whole thing falls apart. So at some point, you're just like, do I have all the puzzle pieces that I think I have here? Or did I skip very important details that are going to make it hard to understand? And of course, you can't know that until you let someone else read, which again, I only did for the first time very recently. And it was definitely the case too, that my friend was like, yeah, this doesn't make any sense. That doesn't make any sense. And I'm like, yeah, I can see that.
You also mentioned, it's the rare case that you would have the ending, beginning, all these things flush out. Is that an exploration path for you? Almost like, you hike in the darkness and then all you see is the rocks right in front of the step, but you kind of know the direction. It's just, you don't know all the pieces yet.
Yeah, it's a pretty good metaphor. I would say very, very solid descriptive language. Everyone's different. I think. I know that there are a lot of professional authors who have very detailed outlines, and you can definitely tell that. It definitely comes through in the work. Just the starts and the finishes tend to be linked a lot better. And part of me is like, that would be really good to do. Another part of me is like, that seems way too much work. I think the writing in itself leading to an unknown destination is kind of cool. Like how would my character respond to a situation like this versus how does the character need to respond to get to a fixed endpoint? To a lot of rambling and windy and sometimes loop-de-looping stories.
Have you ever, as you're writing and you stumble upon a piece where it's very surprising to you, either intellectually or emotionally? I would be actually very interested in the piece if you ever got this undescribable feeling, or you just start.
Something that I have written or something that somebody else has written?
Something that while you're writing.
Oh, think so. Although I do have strong feelings about like some of the characters that I've grown fond of, but I don't think that I have reached the point of sort of aha moment or some sort of emotional discovery for me or any of the characters. But maybe that's something to shoot for, because I've definitely been very attached to other people's characters and had strong emotional reactions to developments in other books, whether it's a character being killed off or a character achieving some goal of theirs or some sort of relationship between characters. Like that definitely all happens. I wonder if it's harder to do in your own writing, or I'm just not there yet, because some of it's the surprise factor, some of it's the build up and the journey. And if you're the one creating the journey, then you sort of know where it's going. Maybe that's a cop out then.
Yeah, I would be very curious if one day you find yourself in a very surprising emotional land, because that might be a key to unlock some stuff that you don't even know. But that's also extremely scary. I'm pretty sure I don't read as much as you do. But when I do sometimes read really good fictions, I find that the reason why the book is considered as classic is because this author has extremely deep insight and understanding of human nature. How do you usually deepen your understanding of human nature?
I think that goes back to one of your questions from earlier, which is what was getting in the way. And it's partly, I guess, is just like reading other stuff and being like, there's no way I could actually like come up with these grand insights about human character, or character of mine could like present some large swath of human society in some way that helps people gain clarity. One of my favorite books of all time is by one of the worst people of all time, is Orson Scott Card, who wrote Ender's Game. And he's just one of the best character writers. And like to think that like any of my characters that I've like thrown down on the page could ever someday rival like Ender or Bean or any of the other great characters in the series is like impossible to believe for me. But that's, I guess, the product of a lot of work and a lot of practice that I have not put in. But yeah, those characters like say things about people and about the power of, for example, about the power of empathy and the power of understanding your companions. And mine are always just going on fun adventures, having good times, telling some stories. Doesn't even feel like they should be mentioned in the same sentence. Have you read Ender's Game? You should definitely read Ender's Game. It's arguably the best science fiction book of all time. Like I said, he's a terrible person. Super homophobic, among other things. And at the end, he was like talking about his writing process and about how the way he thinks about characters is that every character in his story is a different person when they interact with each other character in his story. So not only do you have to have, like, let's say 5 characters, you have to have 5 choose 2 characters. There's the math. Because every character interacts with each other character in a unique way. That seems like so much work. Are you kidding me? The part of the reason that they come off as such like authentic seeming characters, like these are real people, these are interesting people, these are people you care about, is because they are developed with such care and thought and precision. And it's very intimidating.
People who are awful based on a lot of moral ethics judgment that we have, but they create great artwork that somehow pierce through humanity and resonate with people. How do you differentiate like they're actually awful people if they can, resonate with the rest of us so strongly?
Okay, yeah. So you definitely called me out, and that like, probably shouldn't have been making sweeping statements. But Orson Scott Card is on the record as being a homophobe, and for me, that makes you a lower quality individual. That being said, to your earlier question, his books remain some of my favorites, and that's not going to change. And so I am in some case able to separate the art from the artist when it is advantageous for me. Another example of this is often, because we haven't talked about sports enough, often as a fan of baseball or football players, you run into the situation where the players on your favorite team are not necessarily upstanding characters in their own right. So you have the question of how can I root for the team if I don't like the players on the team? And so, for example, there was a player who had an issue with domestic violence, again, making you a less than upstanding person. some people might say a bad person. And then he was traded to my favorite team, and he used to be one of my favorite players. And now I'm like, can I still root for this person who beat his significant other? And the answer is no, you can't. But you still root for the team that he's on. It makes it very, very hazy, and it's uncomfortable. And the easy answer is you just have to like stop pretending that it's helpful to pretend that they're not real people, that they're just like video game characters or book characters, because real people are complicated and they get in the way of enjoying books or sports or many other things.
Right. And I'm going to switch the topic a little bit. I really enjoyed the chat about art and writing, but I'm just going to venture a little bit maybe into your
talk about math and science. Or sports. Sports is good too.
As a transition point of
like too liberal arts for too long.
Yeah. Your sports internship and full-time job at the Major League Baseball.
Yes. So my first job coming out of college was working at Major League Baseball at the office of the commissioner in New York. I didn't really know what to look for when I was starting the job search process. I don't feel comfortable like thinking about the future often, and so a lot of times I find myself having to sort of improvise. And so as I was doing job searching, I was like, well, some people always say that you have to love what you do, and I love sports, so this was an obvious answer. And I managed to run into a useful connection there and ended up interning there for a summer and then turning it into a full-time job for about 2 years. And it was a great first job for sure. I worked on a lot of really fun projects. So our group initially started as kind of a long-term strategic planning task force where we were looking at different ways of improving audience engagement in the game, whether that is more people showing up to games, more people watching on TV, or just changing the way that people interact with baseball in a variety of creative ways, most of which were terrible ideas. And it was then our job to quantitatively show that those were terrible ideas. Although not all of them were terrible ideas. So for example, 2 years ago now, they changed the schedule so that every team plays every other team every year, which was not always the case. This was ostensibly in the name of competitive balance so that it's more fair. But in reality, it was a cash grab like everything else. They were trying to produce more interesting games by not repeating games as often, and therefore more people would tune in and show up, and people did for that and a variety of other reasons. It was not just a one-to-one effect, but we showed in our analysis that there would be a slight increase in attendance. They implemented the policy and the attendance did increase, so that was cool.
I see. Don't you think this is just a common sense to rotate the content?
Common sense is not necessarily the leading mode of decision making in baseball. Especially baseball is a sport with a long history, and professional baseball originated in the 1860s or so, and it's a sport that is mostly followed by older men being very stubborn, resistant to change. And I say this as a youngish man who is also stubborn and resistant to change. And part of that is my baseball fandom, my baseball upbringing. But if you try to change other sports, it goes a lot easier than it goes if you try to change baseball, just because the tradition aspect of it is so strong. And so it wasn't even until 1996, I want to say, somewhere in that range, that even the two halves of the leagues, the American League and the National League, started playing games against one another. And it was a huge change at the time. People hated it. And now people assume it's normal, but it took about 30 years to get there. So, yes, common sense is that you should put the best matchups on the field and have all your teams play all your other teams like the other sports do. But then baseball and baseball fandom gets in the way of that and a lot of other things. And so it took some hard selling. That was not my problem. I was just the one who built some models to say that, like, yeah, this would probably lead to some increased attendance. And our analysis was like a very early exploration, and a lot of other teams did their work and made it possible to actually make that schedule change. But I like to at least say that we were one of the first groups to explore that change.
I would never thought of you as someone who would do marketing related work.
Yeah. So after a lovely year of doing long-term strategic planning, real life got in the way, and the league brought in McKinsey, I think, to reorganize the entire company. And so our little team got merged in with the marketing analytics team, which also already had a large group of data scientists and analysts on the team. So why have two separate data teams when you could just have one big data team? And they sold it to me as like a growth opportunity. Like, digital marketing is a really important skill in today's business world. Everyone should have this chance, and it'll get you to get the opportunity to work with a lot of big data. And there was a ton of data, that's for sure. But I very quickly found myself bouncing off it. Putting a lot of time and effort into a project where the end goal was like putting changing the order of like search results on Google, or putting a spam email in someone's inbox, or changing the strategy of the people posting on Instagram. It was not important to me, and so I left.
When you say sports analytics, I would think about, you actually look at the stats of the players and the angle of the bats, all the fancy stuff you can do with the players and team strategy. Mm-hmm. Was that you had in mind anyone on the team doing that type of job?
Yeah, so that was the goal, right? The state-of-the-art analytics going on right now in sports is being, for the most part, especially in baseball, done by the teams and their employees. And so each team has a large and growing analytics department with people like you and me building out projection systems and optimization models and all that good stuff to enhance the process of putting players on the field to get the best possible team. And there's so much that goes into this now, even over the last 5 years since I stopped trying to do this stuff. Just the amount of science that has gone to like where your fingers go on the ball and what angle you're releasing the ball changes how the ball is spinning by a fractional degree, and that changes how effective it is at fooling hitters. There's so much going on. So that was always the goal, was to get into that world. And I sent some applications out, had some interviews. I got to interview in Yankee Stadium. I got to interview in Dodger Stadium. Some nice bragging. It was very cool. I didn't get either of those jobs, but I thought the commissioner job that I did getting would be a good launch into that world.
I'm just imagining, let's say, 50 years down the road, and every baseball team has a super stellar like data analytics team attached to them, and the players basically become human robots. Like, we're telling them exactly how you position your fingers, your toes, even. And that's kind of weird to think about. And I think potentially at that point in time, the great players are the one who can defy the rationalities and still make a great win despite whatever the statistics say. At least that's my imagination.
Yeah, one of the holdups that I ended up getting was like, as you do more research into like what these analysis teams are doing, what they're focusing on, you can see that more and more work is going into smaller and smaller marginal gains, where the low hanging fruit has been achieved, right? We now have different statistics than we had 20 years ago, and we know we're looking for different things, and there's different ways of measuring skills than there were before, and that's all hugely important. But now all the teams have that, and so now you go to the next level down. You have to dig deeper and dig deeper and dig deeper, and so it takes more and more effort to make smaller and smaller gains. And that sort of was one of the holdups, is do I really want to spend all this time and effort on a fraction of 1% of a win or some made up step? But and the answer was no. Is like, I would like to be focusing on slightly bigger things that feel like better use of my time.
Yeah.
Among other things.
At that point in time, maybe what you should consider is to assemble a team of robotic baseball players, and you just program all of those predictions and let the adversarial models just play against each other.
I sincerely believe that is the future of the NFL for football. I don't know if we'll get to that point in baseball, but at some point, football players are going to want to stop getting concussions, and we'll end up with robotic football. Not wish for the best.
Or cyborg.
Yeah, if you could also just like have the human players and then replace their brains with robots after they get broken.
Okay, that's a little bit dark. After the grad school, you took a turn into the environmental data science realm. Could you please maybe show a little bit more about that realm of work?
Yeah, so as I was reaching the end of grad school and coming back to this decision point. And like I said, I don't really like planning or making decisions. So I reached these points and forced into making decisions. A couple of different things happened. Number one was COVID. So at that point during COVID, all of the sports teams were pretending they were broke. So we're not hiring. And so it forced me to like think about other things. And I had conversations with our career advisor, Tracy, and she was like, what do you want to do? And I was like, I don't know. I thought I was going to go back into sports. But so what I ended up going with was like, I knew something that made me really upset. And that was like working for stuff that I felt didn't matter. And so what does matter? And would that make me happier? And so I had a lot of good friends at that point and who were still working in climate and environmental fields. And that's something, going back to our conversation about the outdoors, like it's a really, the two things are very linked. Like people who feel passionately about spending time outdoors tend to also feel passionately about environmental issues. And I'm no exception to that. And so it made a lot of sense as something to like care about.
That's awesome.
And
maybe share a project story.
the projects I was most proud of were building optimization models for certain sectors of the environment to represent certain sectors of the economy. So the two that I spent the most time on were the electric sector and the industrial sector, and specifically the iron and steel manufacturing in the industrial sector. So electricity and iron and steel manufacturing are both sectors that produce a lot of carbon emissions and other types of emissions, and areas where we know need to be over time to reduce carbon emissions. And so the EPA, the Department of Energy, and the rest of the government have been and will continue to be regulating these sectors with the goal of producing policies that effectively reduce emissions here. And you need tools like this to essentially help you craft those policies to like which policies will work, which ones will not. If there are multiple that work, which ones are better. So as an concrete example, the Inflation Reduction Act was passed in 2022 by the Biden administration and is the biggest climate law that has ever been passed by any country ever. It's a big deal. I feel like it's my duty to communicate that to your audience. It was a big deal. We were not involved in the passage of that law, but people who were involved in the passage of that law use the same kind of models that we work with to essentially say, like, here's which provisions are important for this law. So as part of the lawmaking process, you propose something extremely ambitious, and then real life comes and you have to pull things out. So you can't have everything you want. And so they would just go back and forth with these modeling teams. And like, if we pulled out provision A or provision B, which one should we include to lead to the biggest reductions in carbon? And they'd run the models and come back with an answer. And it's like, you can keep provision B, you can lose provision A. And so what ended up happening was like the best they could do to like reduce as much carbon pollution as possible while satisfying all of these political constraints. Anyway, the reason I use that as an example is because I'm very excited to be transitioning jobs, and the company that I am going to start working for next month is the company that built those models and was working with the Biden administration to make those decisions as part of the Inflation Reduction Act process. And hopefully, as additional laws and regulations and climate rules get passed, it'll be able to be a larger part of that process. And the tools that we build will continue to be.
That is awesome, dude. I'm so excited for you.
At least.
Quick question. Could you please give me an example for what is a provision? What does a provision look like?
Oh, sure. A really easy example is if you buy an electric vehicle now, you get a $7,500 tax credit on that. So it is incentivizing people to buy electric cars instead of gas cars. Similarly, the IRA, Inflation Reduction Act, was very much incentive heavy. It's not like rules. It's gently guiding people through giving them money. So there are a lot of incentives to build out solar and wind power plants instead of gas and coal power plants as well, some of the big ones. And those are the ones that were kept in because these models, these analytical tools, were saying that those were the most effective strategies, among others, proposed.
And how do you really figure out what kind of provisions that you can take out and which ones to keep there? Do you do simulations? Like, what kind of analytics techniques you ended up using?
Yeah, these are simulation models. And so generally speaking, they're optimization models that are representing either a certain sector or the entire economy. And so you'll run the economy with a certain law or provision activated. You'll run the economy without the same thing activated, and you'll see how the carbon emissions from that sector change. You'll also simultaneously, depending on the model, be able to see the changes in prices, changes in quantities of, for example, electricity produced from wind or solar or from fossil plants. And so depending on the tool, you can get a lot of valuable information about how these different decisions are going to affect you and me and the economy at large in an ideal case. And there's always that caveat, right? These are very high level simplifications of very complex systems.
So like when you were doing this type of simulations, do you examine quite a bit of the assumptions, or in general, like assumptions are given and then you're just gonna play with the constraints on top of it?
It's not an easy yes or no answer. There's a lot of assumptions like involved and a lot of things that are just sort of ignored. One of the ones that I like to use as an example is if you read any analysis about the Inflation Reduction Act, it will talk about how much carbon is going to get reduced from the electric sector if we shift to wind and solar, right? That's a given. If you produce more electricity from wind and solar and less electricity from burning coal and burning gas, then there are going to be less emissions. And all of the models show this. A major headache that we as a society have to deal with over the next really now is electricity transmission, which means connecting sources of electricity to demand centers for electricity, aka like our houses. And so wind and solar have to be built in very specific places, places where you can have sunlight and have wind. And that's often not anywhere close to where electricity is being demanded. And so transmission is the wires and stuff that you see everywhere that's connecting these things. And so a lot of these models will basically say, like, we're assuming that transmission gets built. And if it doesn't, none of this works. And it's in there. It's in the small print. But it's not easy. And there's absolutely no guarantee that any of the necessary infrastructure does get built over the next 20, 30, 40 years or sooner, preferably. That's a big assumption.
Do you see that this will be a government-owned infrastructure project for the U.S., or this will be a private sector sort of effort?
I am definitely not the person who should be answering this question, but it's going to be a bit of both. It's an interaction between the government that regulates private and investor-owned utilities. And the main question, essentially, as always, is who's going to pay for these necessary improvements. Usually it's us, the consumer. And the utilities, like all big companies, have a lot of power, both in the policymaking realm and also in the pricing realm. And so it's a back and forth of how much we can get built without, because you don't want public opinion to turn against transmission projects, right? If people see it as like transmission or solar and wind as like raising their prices, which some of the models show will happen and some of the models do not, then suddenly you lose all this momentum that we've gotten and like things slow down. We really can't afford that to happen. So getting this stuff to be built while keeping prices at a reasonable level and wrangling utilities to actually pay for these improvements on their own dime is not a problem. And I'd love to offer optimistic solutions to that, but we're still working on it.
Wow. Okay. There's a lot of pieces going into it. I mean, even just working within a tech company just to get specific project done is already like a huge headache. I cannot imagine the amount of hurdle and agreement and alignment that this type of project needs to get to. And also you were touching a lot of people's interest, right? I'm actually just curious a little bit about the T. What kind of political constraints you ended up running into that you really don't want to deal with, but you kind of have to just make an adjustment because of that?
I don't have any good juicy stories at this point. Like we've been pretty insulated from a lot of the politics so far, at least in my old job. I don't know if the same will be true at my new job, but I'll get back to you if there's any fun stories about run-ins with politicians or lobbyists or anything.
Fair enough. I guess what keeps you going? The answer is sort of obvious, but I still want to hear it.
What do you think the answer is?
You care. You just care deeply.
That's what I was hoping, would be the motivation, right? Like when I was at the baseball job doing the digital marketing, I was like, I need to care more, and that will make it easier to go to work 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, most of the days per year. And it definitely has, but it hasn't gotten me all the way there. Like work is still a grind. And there were days that I was like, this doesn't feel like it matters at all. So I'm still working, still trying to figure it out, hoping the next job will be better than the last, and look for incremental improvement. But yes, I think a certain amount of like large scale motivation has helped me be more excited about what I'm doing and feel like I am not wasting my time as much.
Every choice has its own cost and suffering attached to it. It's just a matter of what type of suffering you're willing to choose, right? You care about this issue enough to stay in the game right now. Yeah. What are you looking forward to?
I have now 5 weeks before I have to start my next job. Very much looking forward to continuing not working. It's been great so far. Spent a lot of time on the beach last week. So spent some family time this week. Got a couple of small trips planned, some hiking, some baseball.
Enjoy your leisure time, and hopefully once you start your job, there will be more interesting tea coming out of it.
Yeah. I'll get back to you. I'll keep you posted.